Military expenditures around the world. What do we know? We're going to look at 5 questions. Does the UN spend more on military than the rest of the world combined? And if so, in which periods? Which wars can you see in military spendings? Which can't? Was there a peace dividend after the end of the Cold War around 1990? And if so, for whom? What is not included in military expenditures as measured? And how much per person is spent on the military? This graph is taken from partly the internet, but it's essentially a graph gathered by American defense institutions. And we start after the Second World War in 1949, and we end in 2023, which is the year where we roughly know what the expenditures has been. And what you're mainly looking at is government expenditures on military, as you can find in the budgets of major countries. And you see in 1949, there was about 400 billion spent in the whole world on military expenditure. And this is all adjusted for inflation. So that is, truly, as it were, in today's money, what would have been spent. And now we're looking at over 2 trillion in 2023. Over 2 trillion, and this is increasing in 24 and 25, but we don't quite yet know what has been spent. Now, a little bit for orientation, the size of the entire economy of the world is around 100 trillion, and so 2.3 trillion is roughly 2.3% of all expenditure in the world. That's roughly what we're looking at. And if you look at what this whole red blob is, that is what the Soviet Union used to spend on military expenditure, according to the Americans. Right? So this is not what the Soviets themselves said. This is much more what the CIA and the Americans inferred that they were spending. And there was a reason for them to exaggerate a little bit, because they could say, look at these Soviets, they're spending so much, we must spend more as well. So you see the fluctuations for the whole world, up and down. There was a big dip here in the mid-90s. There was a bit of a dip in the mid-50s. And you see that now the world is spending a lot more, and Europe has already promised that it's going to spend more. You see military expenditures going up in China and elsewhere. And so the world is heading for more military expenditures again. Let's get into the 5 questions. Does the US spend more on its military than the rest of the world combined? Well, we can have a look, right? What about at the end here? In 2023, the US spent about 880 billion, according to this information, on its military. And the whole world spent about 2.3 trillion. So the US spent something like 40% of all world expenditures, which is not about 50%. So it's less than half. So when was it half or more than half? Well, here, the mid-2000s, it spent more. It spent more around about the mid-80s, and it definitely spent more than the start of the 50s and mid-60s. So for quite a bit of this time period, the US has spent more than half of all world military expenditures, but not at the moment. And also the increase is now higher in Europe and China probably than it will be in the USA. And so we are no longer in the era where America outspends everybody combined, but it's still a major chunk of world military expenditure. And for long periods of time, it used to be higher than the rest combined. And of course, the heyday of American economic hegemony, so when America was by far the biggest economy of the world, was very much this era. Right? This is when America was relatively much bigger in an economic sense than it is now, and hence could more easily afford to have more military spending than the rest of the world combined. This period is also interesting, and we're going to talk about why that was, that in the mid-noughties, as it were, you had more military expenditure by America than the rest, even though its economy relative to the 50s and 60s was much smaller in terms of world size. Now, which wars do you see in military spending and which not? Here you have to know a lot about history. And so you can start having a look at when did military expenditure go up and what was likely going on. Let's first look at this period here. Right? You see a big increase in military expenditure, and you see particularly a huge increase in American military expenditure. Right? So at the start here in 1949, the Americans were not outspending the Soviets by much at all, and there was more than a doubling in US military expenditure. Right? Military expenditure had been winding down from the Second World War, which ended in 1945, and was much lower than it was during that Second World War, but went up. What war is that, you may ask? And the answer is the Korean War. So the Korean War ended in 1953, and by the end of 1953, the American military spending was at least double what it was in 1949, right? And remained high. Right? But also notice, this is interesting about wars, is that military expenditure don't immediately rack up to an enormous amount because it takes time for a military machinery to be able to absorb military spending. Right? You can say to a factory, I want you to be huge and give me lots of tanks and ships and airplanes, but actually it takes a while for the factories to be set up, for workers to be found, for designs to be implemented. And so you can't actually increase military expenditure immediately in 1 week or a second to be double what it was before if you have a decent sized military. And you see here, hence, that it took about 2 or 3 years for American military expenditure to crank up to its maximum level in order to win or at least force a truce in the Korean War. And you see in that same period that the Soviet Union didn't start spending all that much more because they weren't really involved in the Korean War. Who was involved in the Korean War? China. And you can see that China is basically part of the rest of the world there. It's this little pink bit, and it hardly registered. Did that mean that China didn't have a military then? No, it did have a military, but it had a very small economy. And so its expenditures on the military were very small. They had lots of soldiers, very cheap material, and they lost a huge amount of men in the Korean War, as did North and South Korea themselves. But you definitely see, hence, the effect of the war, and you also see the slow decrease after the war. So you only see a little bit of a decrease then from the end of the Korean War. If you like, a small peace dividend. When does it crank up again? It cranks up again in this period. What do you think this period is? Well, that period is the Vietnam War. Right? This is when America again gets involved in a major foreign war, and it cranks up its war machinery, sends its planes and its soldiers to go and fight in Vietnam. That happened from 1965 onwards till the early 70s. And there again, after that, it sort of went down. Right? You also see an increased military expenditure of the Soviet Union, which was then also starting to be involved more in wars in Africa and elsewhere. When does it go up again? Well, you see the glut here, right? What is that glut? You might say this is Reagan, the Star Wars program. This is also when the Soviets get involved very heavily in Afghanistan, which sort of bankrupted them. And the Americans were as it were, preparing, if you like, their wars, but they were particularly interested in new military technology. Then you see a reduction, right? And you see a cranking up again, this period. What is this period? This period is 9/11. This period is the war on terror as it's known. So the Americans were challenged by Islamic fundamentalism. That is the way they saw it. And you see this huge increase in military expenditure amongst the Americans. Here, the dark blue, that is NATO, effectively Europe, plus places like Australia, Canada. They are involved in that, but their military expenditure didn't go much up during the war on terror. It's really the Americans who fought that and who increased. Also, what you see in this period, that the rest of the world starts to matter, because the rest of the world is growing in terms of its economy, and so its military expenditure starts to be more noticeable. You see more expenditure in the Middle East, which is in this grey bit. You also see more military expenditure in places like India and throughout Africa and Latin America. Effectively, the rest of the world gets bigger and starts to matter more. And then the final war, that's this one. You can guess what this is. This is partly, of course, the Ukraine conflict. This is also other conflicts around the world. There's sort of major conflicts now in parts of Africa, and there's major conflicts in parts of Southeast Asia. And so there too, you see the increase going up. Now, you do see that the Russians here don't really spend much relative to the US and the rest of NATO. If you count this up, the US and NATO in 2023 spent about 1.3 trillion, and compared to that, Russia spent 1/10, 126 billion. So Russian military expenditure was only 1/10, but Russian military production is much cheaper than that of the West, and so Russia was still able to sort of outproduce much of the West in terms of key military material in that period. China, you see, spends a lot more than Russia. It's a much bigger economy and spent about 300 billion, which is about 1/4 of what the whole of the West, the US, plus the rest of NATO combined spends. And so you see that in that sense, the threat is us, right? We are the ones who rule the roost when it comes to military expenditure. But other countries are also starting to matter more. And the other countries, of course, are the other economic powerhouses that are emerging, such as India, such as Latin America, which is growing, Brazil, and all those other countries. Could you see a peace dividend in this graph? Yes, you can see a peace dividend. When does military spending really reduce? There you go. That is the big dip that you see in world military expenditure in this long time period. And when was that? That was the end of the Cold War. Right? That was 1990s. And so the end of the Cold War indeed meant a huge reduction in military expenditure. And for whom could you see the reduction? Well, you could see it here in the rest of NATO. That went down a bit. And even though NATO expanded, because quite a few of the former Soviet Union countries, like the Baltics, like much of Eastern Europe, joined NATO, and still overall NATO military expenditure reduced, excluding the Americans. And so there was indeed a peace dividend, and it was mainly had by Europe, if you like. But you also see that the Americans started to spend quite a bit less in that period up to the 90s. You know, their military shrunk by maybe a third to that degree. But of course, the peace dividend was most spectacular for the Soviet Union itself, which collapsed, and its military spending collapsed as well. For the rest of the world, you see less of a collapse simply because they weren't involved in the Cold War itself. But was there hence a peace dividend? Definitely there was. And it would be nice to see future peace dividends as well. Now, whenever one sees statistics, whenever one looks at a graph, it is very important to think, what am I not seeing in this? Right? And that requires one to really dig into how this kind of data is collected and what is exaggerated, what is undercounted. Now, that is, of course, something you can't do just looking at this graph. You have to do background work. So I can tell you a couple of things that are not in this graph, that are not counted as military expenditure, or that are counted as military expenditure that perhaps should not be in here. So one thing is that the Soviet Union's military expenditure are probably exaggerated when we look at this, and that was probably for political reasons. That sort of requires knowledge of how the American military establishment works. But also there's something else which is not on this graph. If you look at the military expenditure of the USA, 880 billion, what are we really talking about? We're talking about military equipment, we're talking about their soldiers, we're talking about the roughly 800 American military bases, everything that has to do with that, and the infrastructure around that. But what is, for instance, not in this figure of 880 billion? Well, what is not in this figure is, for instance, expenditures on veterans, right? What is not in this figure is the expenditures on infrastructure that is used by the military, such as the harbors and the roads, and the sort of maintenance of water and other aspects that feed into military bases and into the military machinery. And so it has been estimated that the actual expenditure of the Americans, if you count in all these other aspects of as it were, maintaining its military or looking after ex-soldiers, their healthcare, their pensions, and this and that, would elevate the US military spending to $1.5 trillion. Right? So perhaps the true figure is more like 1,500 billion US dollars, which would make it well over half the rest of the world. But of course, the same argument would go for the rest of the world as well, that probably we are looking at undercounts as to how much societies actually spend on military expenditure. And the big ticket items that are not in here are the healthcare, the pensions, looking after the disabled, and particularly looking after veterans. That will also have been true in this period, where there was still a lot of disabled people, who sort of suffered from the Second World War and who had to be looked after by their communities. If you add that up, then probably the cost of these conflicts is much, much bigger. So it has, for instance, been estimated here for the Iraq War, which is the second Iraq War, which is 2003, 2004, that the American society as a whole spent several $1 trillion in order to look after all those veterans and in order to have all the other infrastructure that was needed for that particular conflict. And that kind of thing one cannot know from this graph. You have to dig through it and then ask yourself, well, okay, what am I truly learning from this graph? Probably there's an undercounting which happens for all countries involved. So probably the world as a whole is spending more like 3 or 4% on all things to do with its military. But it's not such a bad indication as to the general trends. Because of course, if there's no conflicts, you also don't have new veterans. Right? And so probably the general trends are still reasonably valid. How much is spent per person on the military? Well, for this, you need to know something that is not in this graph as well, which is how many people does the world have? Well, in 2023, the world had close to 8 billion people. So then it's a quite simple calculation. It's 8 billion people who together are spending something like $2.3 billion. How much is that per person in this world? Who's good at calculation? It's about $300 per person in this world that is being spent on the military. Much more, of course, spent by the average American. And how many Americans are there? About 330 million. So if you do the same calculations for the Americans, it's more like $2,500 to $3,000 that they would have spent per American on their military. But for the world as a whole, it's only $300 per person per year that is spent on everything. Now, I said before, this is about 2 to 4% of the total economy in the world, depending on whether we also add up veteran costs and the other military expenditure that's not on this. And you can say that's $4 out of every 100 that we trade, that we make products with. And so that's quite a lot, but it could also be much worse if you like.